The slap of the closing door was a sound as final as a nail in a coffin lid. It echoed in the narrow, muddy street of Promise Creek, a punctuation mark on the end of her childhood. At 17, Elara stood alone, the weight of a small canvas sack pulling on one shoulder, and the heavier weight of her new reality pressing down on all of her. Inside the house that was no longer hers, her stepfather, Mr. Finch, was likely already sitting down to his supper, her absence a mere inconvenience, a chair scraped back from the table. He had not been a cruel man, not in the way of stories. He had simply been a man of straight lines and hard facts. And the hardest fact of all was that Elara was not his blood. With her mother gone, buried 6 weeks now under the frozen soil of the parish churchyard, Elara had become a complication. A mouth to feed, a space to occupy, a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of his life. He had solved the problem with a handful of coins and a folded piece of paper. "Your mother's," he had said, his voice flat, avoiding her eyes. He pressed the coins into her palm. They were cold and few. "And this, your father's folly. It's all that's left of his name." He had handed her the deed, its paper brittle and yellowed with age. He did not have to say the rest. He did not have to say, "Now you are no one's burden but your own." The closing door said it for him. She looked down at her inheritance, $10, a deed to a place called the Blackwood Mill, a place she knew only by its reputation as a pile of rotten timbers in a useless ravine 3 miles from town. In her sack, she had her mother's things, a worn whetstone, a small but sharp utility knife, and a hand axe with a handle her own father had carved. She also had a spare wool shirt, a half-eaten loaf of bread, and a single blanket. This was the sum of her life. The people of Promise Creek watched her from behind their curtains. They had seen it happen. They had seen Mr. Finch's cold dismissal. Now they waited to see what she would do. Mr. Gable, the owner of the town's mercantile, and a man whose opinions carried the weight of Scripture, stepped out onto his porch. He was a thick man, built of certainty and profit. "Well now, girl," he said, his voice a mixture of pity and impatience. "A sorry state. The parish council has discussed it. We can find you a place with the Millers. They need help with the children. It'll be hard work, but you'll have a roof and food." He meant an indentured life, a debt she could never repay. Elara looked at his face, at the faces peeking from the windows around the town square. She saw their judgment, their certainty that she was doomed. They saw a girl, an orphan, a piece of driftwood to be swept away by the current. They saw weakness. The thought of accepting their pity felt like swallowing ash. "No, thank you, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The words felt strange and powerful in her own mouth. He blinked, surprised by her refusal. "Then what? You can't stay in the street. That land, that mill is nothing, a ghost. Your father broke himself trying to make it work. It's worthless." She clutched the deed in her hand. "It's mine," she said. It was the only thing in the world that was. With a resolve that felt like a hot coal in her stomach, she turned away from him. She walked into his mercantile, the bell above the door announcing her defiant presence. The whispers followed her in. She placed her $10 on the counter. She bought a small sack of flour, a tin of salt, a pound of dried beans, a box of matches, and a length of sturdy rope. The purchase took almost all her money. Mr. Gable tallied the cost with a shake of his head, his expression making it clear he believed he was selling supplies to a ghost. When she stepped back outside, the sack now heavier, she did not look at anyone. She turned her back on the clapboard houses, on the church steeple, on the pity and the judgment. She turned her face toward the cold gray hills that huddled on the horizon and began to walk. Each step was a silent declaration. She would not be broken. She would not be their charity case. She would go to her worthless land and face whatever came next on her own terms. The journey was a punishment. The road dissolved into a rutted track, and the track became a faint trail choked with last year's dead leaves. The wind sharpened, a blade against her cheeks, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The weight of her supplies was a biting force on her shoulders, each step a small war against gravity and exhaustion. The landscape grew wilder, the trees thicker, the hills steeper. Promise Creek and its small, ordered world vanished behind her, swallowed by the wilderness. She was utterly alone. After hours that felt like days, she found the ravine. It was a deep scar in the earth, shadowed and unwelcoming. At the bottom, a creek snaked through a jumble of gray stones, and there, beside it, was her inheritance. The word collapsed did not do it justice. It was a carcass. The great water wheel was a skeleton of splintered, moss-eaten wood, tilting drunkenly into a stagnant pool of black water. The mill itself was a heap of shattered timbers and fallen stones, its roof gone, its walls breached. It looked as if a giant had smashed his fist down upon it and left it to rot. A cold dread, far colder than the wind, seeped into Alara's bones. Mr. Gable was right. The town was right. This was not a place to live. It was a place to die. This was a tomb. She slid down the muddy bank, the soles of her boots finding no purchase, and landed hard at the bottom. She dropped her sack and stared at the ruin, the hot coal of her resolve turning to ice in her gut. Tears she had refused to shed in town now burned behind her eyes. Despair was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs, making her knees weak. For a long, silent moment, she believed they had won. But as she stood there, shivering in the gloom of the ravine, she heard it. A sound beneath the sighing of the wind. It was a low, constant murmur. It wasn't the sound of the sluggish creek in front of the ruin. This was different, clearer, stronger. She followed the sound around the edge of the collapsed foundation, pushing through thorny brambles that tore at her coat. The sound grew louder, leading her to the back of the ruin, where the stone foundation was built directly against a sheer rock face. And there, she saw it. Water, pure and clear, gushed from a wide fissure in the cliff. It was the true source of the creek, an underground spring that flowed with tireless energy. It was this water that had once powered the mill. It tumbled over smooth stones, clean and cold and alive. She knelt and cupped her hands, drinking deeply. The water was so cold it made her teeth ache, but it was the taste of life itself. Hope, fragile as a new shoot, pushed through the frozen soil of her despair. She turned her attention to the foundation. It was made of massive, rough-hewn river stones, and while the wooden structure above had been obliterated, this stone base was largely intact, a three-sided box built against the cliff. She stepped through a breach in the wall, her boots crunching on fallen debris. Inside, the air changed. The biting wind vanished, replaced by a profound stillness. The air was cool, but it lacked the sharp, aggressive chill of the outside. It was a dead, calm cold, the cold of a cellar. She ran her bare hand along the stone of the cliff face that formed the back wall of the foundation. It was cool to the touch, but not icy. The immense thermal mass of the rock, she realized, acted as a barrier against the weather. It held the deep, constant temperature of the earth itself. It resisted the wind. It resisted the cold. She looked up. A smaller fissure, a dark crack, ran up the rock face from inside the foundation, vanishing into the darkness above. A natural chimney. In that moment, the ruin transformed before her eyes. It was not a tomb. It was a shield. It was 3 walls and a spring of endless water. It was a natural defense against the wind. It was shelter, waiting to be reclaimed. The town saw a pile of worthless rubble. Her father had seen a mill. But Ilara, standing in the protected quiet of that stone foundation, saw a home. The despair did not vanish, but it now had a new companion, a grim, fierce, and burning resolve. This place was not her father's folly, it would be her fortress. The work began with destruction. Before she could build, she had to clear the wreckage of the past. She used her rope and all her body weight to drag the largest of the rotten timbers away from the stone foundation. The wood was heavy, waterlogged, and slick with green moss. It fought her, snagging on rocks and roots. Her hands, soft from a life indoors, were soon raw. Blisters rose on her palms, broke and bled, the raw skin stinging in the cold air. She worked from dawn until the last light failed, fueled by a desperate urgency. Every fallen beam she moved, every pile of rubble she cleared with her bare hands, was a small victory. Her muscles screamed in protest. At night, she would huddle under her single blanket in a corner of the foundation, sheltered from the worst of the wind, and eat a handful of cold beans. Exhaustion was a heavy blanket, so deep it was its own kind of numbness. In the darkness, she could feel the throb of her abused hands and the deep ache in her back, but she could also feel the slow, satisfying transformation of the space around her. Once the foundation was clear, she began to build. She scavenged the fallen timbers, sorting them. Most were too rotted to use, but some of the main beams, made of hardwood and partially protected by the collapse, were still solid. These became the bones of her roof. Using the rope and a crude lever, she wrestled them into place, laying them from the top of the stone foundation walls to ledges she found on the cliff face. It was brutal, dangerous work. More than once, a beam slipped, crashing down just inches from where she stood. But she learned. She learned to watch the balance, to feel the weight, to use the terrain to her advantage. For the front wall, she needed to fell trees. Her father's small axe was her only tool. She chose young, straight pines from the slope above the ravine. The first tree took her an entire day. Her swings were clumsy, the axe bouncing off the hard wood. But with each swing, she found a rhythm. The sharp thwack of the blade biting into wood became the percussion of her new life. When the tree finally groaned and crashed to the ground, she felt a surge of triumph so fierce it almost brought her to her knees. She limbed it, cut it to length, and began the agonizing process of dragging the logs down the slope to her building site. While searching for stones to patch the foundation, her hands, digging in the damp earth near the creek, found a new treasure, a thick, heavy deposit of gray clay. It was dense and sticky. She remembered her mother mixing a paste of clay and straw to patch their old hearth. She experimented, mixing the clay with sand from the creek bed and dried grasses. The result was a thick, heavy mortar. She used it to fill the gaps in the foundation walls, making them solid and airtight. She used it to build a massive stone hearth and chimney against the back cliff face, aligning it perfectly with the natural fissure in the rock. The day she lit the first fire was a turning point. She stacked dry wood in the hearth she had built with her own bloody hands and struck a match. The kindling caught, and flames licked up the logs. Smoke, thick and white, billowed for a moment, and then, miraculously, it was drawn upward. It flowed into the fissure in the rock and vanished. She ran outside and looked up at the cliff face. High above, almost lost against the gray sky, a thin, pale wisp of smoke emerged from the rock and was immediately torn apart by the wind. A smokeless chimney. She had a fire. She had warmth. That night, for the first time, She slept in a space that felt less like a ruin and more like a room. Her next project was water. The spring was her lifeline, but she didn't want to venture outside for it in the deep of winter. She spent a week digging a narrow channel from the spring's main flow, diverting a small, steady trickle of water along the cliff face and directly through a small opening she made in her back wall. Inside, she had dug a deep pit, which she meticulously lined with a thick layer of her clay mortar, packing it down until it was smooth and waterproof. The trickle of water flowed into her pit, slowly filling it. She had created a cistern, a source of fresh, clean, unfrozen water right inside her home. With the basic needs of shelter, warmth, and water met, she turned to food. She knew the ground outside would soon freeze solid, but the air in the deepest part of her shelter, back against the cliff, remained constantly cool. It was a natural root cellar. She took the idea one step further. She spent 2 weeks hauling buckets of rich, black soil from a grove of aspens up on the ridge, carrying them one by one into the dim interior. She built shallow, timber-lined beds and filled them with the soil. In this subterranean garden, protected from the frost and wind, she planted the seeds she hoped to buy: potatoes, turnips, carrots, and hardy greens that could survive in low light. After a month of relentless labor, she knew she needed more. She needed a source of food that would sustain itself. She needed livestock. Taking the few coins she had left, she walked the 3 miles back to Promise Creek. The town had not changed, but she had. Her hands were calloused, her face was leaner, and her eyes held a new, hard-won stillness. When she walked into Gable's Mercantile, the conversations stopped. People stared at her clothes, stained with mud and clay, at her hands, which looked like a man's. Mr. Gable looked her over, a flicker of surprise in his eyes that he quickly masked with condescension. "Still alive, I see," he said. "Come for that spot with the Millers?" "I've come to buy," she said, her voice steady. She placed her last coins on the counter. "I need 2 laying hens, a rooster, and 1 of your piglets, the small one." A ripple of murmurs went through the store. A piglet? Chickens? For the girl living in a pile of rocks? It was madness. Mr. Gable couldn't hide his smirk. "A piglet, is it? Planning on raising it in that ruin? Girl, you're throwing good money after bad." "It's my money," she said simply. He shrugged, happy to take it. He sold her the animals, crating the chickens and handing her a rope tied to the piglet's leg. As she walked out of the store, the whispers were like the rustling of dry leaves. She heard the words, "Gable's Folly." They were talking about her. She did not look back. She tugged the stubborn piglet, balanced the crate of squawking chickens, and started the long walk home. On the trail back, as the sun began to dip below the hills, she realized she was being followed. A dog, skeletal and wary, shadowed her from a distance. It was a mix of breeds, with mottled gray fur and ribs starkly visible beneath its hide. It kept its distance, but its hungry eyes never left her. When she stopped to rest, she broke off a piece of the bread she had in her sack and tossed it. The dog snatched it from the air and devoured it in a single gulp. It followed her all the way back to the mill. That night, as the fire burned low, the dog lay just outside the opening where her door would one day be, a silent, watchful presence. She gave it the last of her bread. The next morning, it was still there. It never left again. She named him Shadow for the way he followed her every move. He became her only companion, a warm body to curl up against in the cold, a low growl to warn her of a fox in the night, a silent witness to her solitary toil. The bond between them was forged in the shared silence of the wilderness, a quiet understanding that they were both strays, surviving on the scraps the world had left them. The town's mockery soon found a voice. A trapper named Brant, a man known for his rugged self-assurance and sharp tongue, made his way down the ravine one afternoon while checking his lines. He saw what Elara was building. He saw the log wall, the smoke-stained cliff, the penned-in animals. He didn't offer help. He stood with his hands on his hips and laughed, a loud, barking sound that echoed off the rocks. "Well, I'll be," he shouted, his voice dripping with scorn, "the little orphan girl, building her own tomb. You'll be frozen solid in that hole come first snow, girl. That rock will suck the heat right out of you. You're a fool." He turned and walked away, still chuckling. The story spread through Promise Creek like a winter sickness. Elara became a local legend, a cautionary tale. The Mill Girl, they called her, or more often, Gable's Folly. Mr. Gable polished the story with each telling in his store, describing her absurd purchases, her stubborn silence, her inevitable, tragic end. The community, bound by its conventional wisdom, agreed. She was a fool, and the coming winter would be her reckoning. Elara heard none of it, but she felt it. She felt the weight of their collective judgment every time she looked toward the distant hills that hid the town. But their scorn was a distant noise, drowned out by the rhythms of her new life. As autumn deepened and the air grew sharp with the promise of frost, her world shrank to the small, ordered universe she had built. Her days fell into a strict routine. At dawn, she would rise in the cool, firelit dark. She would add wood to the embers in the great stone hearth, the thermal mass of the rock around it still radiating a gentle warmth from the night before. She would fetch fresh water from her indoor cistern, the sound of the steady trickle from the spring, a constant reassurance. She would feed the chickens and the pig, who were housed in a sturdy lean-to she'd built against the warmest part of the stone foundation, their body heat adding to the shelter's warmth. After her own meager breakfast of oatmeal or a baked potato, she would tend her subterranean garden. In the dim, steady coolness, the rows of green shoots were a miracle. The carrots, turnips, and potatoes thrived in the rich soil, protected from the increasingly harsh weather outside. She would spend hours there, cultivating, watering, feeling the damp earth in her hands. It was a secret, living pantry. The afternoons were for wood. Winter demanded a mountain of it. With Shadow at her side, she would fell trees, limb them, and haul the logs back to the shelter, her body now hard and efficient. The axe felt like an extension of her arm. She stacked the firewood in a long, high wall inside the shelter, a fortress against the coming cold. As winter finally clamped its jaws on the land, her systems were tested. A pack of wolves, drawn by the scent of her pig, circled the shelter one night, their howls echoing in the ravine. Shadow's furious barking from behind the sturdy timber door and the solid stone walls kept them at bay. They were a threat she could hear, but not feel. Later, an early, wet blizzard buried the ravine in a foot of heavy snow. She found a few small leaks in her chinking, where the wind drove moisture through, and spent a frantic day mixing clay and patching them from the inside. Each small test overcome was a confirmation. Her systems worked. She was safe. The town was wrong. The first true storm of the season was a warning. But the blizzard that arrived in the third week of January was something else entirely. It was not weather. It was a physical entity, a monster of wind and ice. It came from the north, like a pale, screaming army, and it fell upon Promise Creek without mercy. The wind didn't howl. It shrieked like tearing metal. It was a solid force that slammed against walls and tore at roofs. The snow was not flakes, but a blinding horizontal wall of white, an endless torrent that erased the world. In town, the community's confidence shattered within hours. The conventional, timber-framed houses that had seemed so sturdy now groaned and shuddered. The wind found every crack, every weakness, driving icy drafts into rooms where families huddled around their fires. Chimneys, improperly built, clogged with wind-driven snow and ice, filling houses with blinding, choking smoke. People were forced to extinguish their fires, and the killing cold crept in. Roofs, built at a gentle pitch, began to sag under the impossible weight of the snow. The sound of splintering timber became common. The miller's barn collapsed, killing their milk cow. Mr. Gable's mercantile lost a third of its roof, ruining sacks of flour and sugar. The church, the designated emergency shelter, proved to be a trap. The north wall, facing the brunt of the storm, cracked with a sound like a gunshot, and a web of fractures spread across the plaster. The town's preparations, their collective wisdom, were useless against the storm's fury. They were isolated, freezing, and terrified. 3 miles away, in the ravine, Ilara's shelter was an island of profound calm. The screaming of the wind was a dull, distant roar, a sound from another world. The massive stone foundation and the solid wall of the cliff face were indifferent to its rage. They did not shudder or groan. They simply endured, immovable and silent. The snow piled up outside, burying her home completely, but it only served to insulate it further. Inside, the great hearth burned steadily, its smoke drawn cleanly up the fissure in the rock. The massive stones of the fireplace and the cliff wall soaked up the heat, radiating a deep, constant warmth throughout the entire space. Her animals were calm and warm in their protected lean-to. Her subterranean garden was entirely untouched, a hidden world of green life. The spring-fed cistern provided an endless supply of fresh water. Ilara was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach. She sat by the fire, mending a tear in her shirt, listening to the muffled fury of the outside world, with Shadow sleeping peacefully at her feet. She was not just surviving, she was secure. On the third day of the blizzard, as the storm reached the peak of its violence, a new sound cut through the dull roar of the wind. It was a frantic, desperate banging on her heavy timber door. Shadow leaped to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Ilara froze, her heart pounding. No one should be out in this. No one could be out in this. She unbarred the door and pulled it inward against the pressing snow. A figure, a man encrusted in ice and snow, stumbled and collapsed across her threshold. He was a ghost of ice, his face a mask of frostbite and raw terror. As she dragged him inside and pushed the door shut, she recognized him. It was Brant, the trapper, the man who had laughed at her. He was barely conscious, his words a ragged, broken whisper. "My family. Cabin. A mile from here. Firewood's gone. Roof." He coughed, a dry, racking sound. He had been trying to reach Promise Creek for help when he saw the faint wisp of smoke from her hidden chimney. It had been his only hope. His wife and young son were in their cabin, freezing to death. Ilara looked down at the man who had called her a fool, who had mocked her work and wished for her demise. A bitter, cold memory of his laughter echoed in her mind. She looked at her own stores, her mountain of firewood, her preserved food, her carefully managed resources. Helping him would cost her. It would tax the very systems that were keeping her alive. Helping him meant risking her own safety. But then she looked at his face, stripped of all its arrogance, and saw only the terror of a husband and a father. She saw not the man who had scorned her, but a human being at the edge of oblivion. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a simple, stark necessity. You do not let people die if you can stop it. She had built this fortress to save herself, but its strength was meaningless if it could not be shared. She worked quickly. She stripped Brant of his frozen outer clothes and wrapped him in her own blanket, sitting him close to the fire. She ladled hot broth from the pot simmering over the hearth and forced him to drink. The warmth began to bring him back from the brink. As he recovered, she prepared for the rescue. She had a small, sturdy sled she had built for hauling firewood. She loaded it with a heavy canvas sack of split logs, several bricks that she had heated in the fire until they were glowing hot, and her own precious blanket. She wrapped the hot bricks in thick cloth. They would be small, portable stoves. With Shadow now whining with a nervous energy, she put on her warmest clothes, secured the rope from the sled around her waist, and opened the door to the screaming white hell of the storm. The journey to Brant's cabin was a waking nightmare. The wind was a physical blow, trying to knock her from her feet. The snow was so deep she had to fight for every step, the sled a dead weight behind her. She could not see more than a few feet in front of her face. The world was a chaotic, blinding swirl of white. But Shadow, his instincts true, led the way. He pushed through the drifts, his dark form the only landmark in the maelstrom, and she followed. It was a mile that felt like 100. She found the cabin half buried, a dark shape in the snow. The roof was sagging ominously. Inside, it was barely warmer than the storm. Brant's wife was huddled over their son, trying to shield him with her own body. They were wrapped in every piece of cloth they owned, their faces pale and bluish, their breathing shallow. They were dying. Elara did not waste time with words. She unwrapped the hot bricks and tucked them inside the family's layers of clothes. She built a small, hot fire in their cold hearth with her own dry wood. As warmth began to seep back into the tiny, frigid room, she helped the mother and son to their feet and led them out into the storm, back toward the promise of her shelter. The return journey was even harder, but fueled by the desperate need to save them, they made it. When Brant saw his wife and son stumble through the door of Elara's shelter, alive, he broke down, his body shaking with sobs of relief and shame. As they settled in, their eyes slowly adjusted to the warm, firelit space, and their shock was absolute. The first thing that hit them was the warmth. It was not the scorching, temporary heat of a desperate fire, but a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to come from the very stones. Then they saw it all. The neat stack of firewood that reached the ceiling, the quiet clucking of chickens in their clean, dry pen, the sight of green life, the rows of carrots and turnips growing in their beds in the back of the shelter, a vision of summer in the heart of a killing winter. They saw the cistern of clear, fresh water. They saw the sleeping piglet, the watchful dog. They could not reconcile this organized, thriving sanctuary with the story the town told of the foolish girl in the collapsed mill. This was not a tomb, it was an ark. The storm raged for 2 more days. In Promise Creek, a desperate search party had formed for Brant and his family. Led by Mr. Gable, they set out when the wind died down just enough to make travel possible, if not safe. They followed Brant's faint tracks, a trail of despair that led them not toward the town, but into the ravine. They expected to find 3 frozen bodies. When they arrived at the mill, they saw a structure buried in snow, with a single, sturdy door and a thin wisp of smoke rising impossibly from the cliff face above it. Gable hammered on the door, shouting Brant's name. When Elara opened it, the wave of warmth that washed over them was like a physical blow. They stared past her, their faces slack with disbelief. They saw Brant, his wife, and his son, alive and safe. They saw the fire, the animals, the garden. They saw a world that should not exist. Mr. Gable, the man of hard facts and straight lines, looked at Elara. He looked at everything she had built with her own 2 hands, everything they had mocked. He saw the truth of his own ignorance. and it was a humbling, crushing weight. He stepped forward, his face stripped of a lifetime of pride. "We were wrong," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The other men behind him nodded in silent, shamed agreement. "We called you a fool." My God. He looked around the shelter again, his eyes wide. We were the fools. Ilara looked at the faces of the men who had dismissed her, pitied her, and laughed at her. She felt no triumph, no surge of vindication. There was only the quiet, steady hum of the world she had built. She simply nodded and stepped aside, gesturing with her head toward the pot of stew simmering over the fire. "There is food," she said. "Eat." Her grace was more stunning than their own failure. She fed them, offered them a place by her fire, and asked for nothing in return. Her quiet generosity was her only reply to their lifetime of judgment. When the great blizzard of '83 finally broke, Promise Creek was a town in ruins. But it was not a town without hope. Ilara's shelter, the place once called Gable's Folly, became the heart of the recovery. She shared her stores of potatoes and carrots, her smoked meat, and the eggs from her chickens. Her home became a refuge for the families whose own houses were destroyed. The relationship between Ilara and the community transformed overnight. The mockery vanished, replaced by a deep and profound respect. They no longer called her the mill girl. They called her Ilara, and when speaking of her home, they called it the millstone, for it had become the foundation upon which the town's survival was being rebuilt. Mr. Gable, true to his word, publicly apologized before the entire parish and gave her a lifetime of unlimited credit at his store, an offer she rarely used. Brant became her most loyal friend and protector, helping her clear more land and expand her small domain. The lessons learned from that terrible winter changed Promise Creek forever. People began to build differently. New homes were constructed with deep stone foundations and massive hearths designed to hold thermal mass. The value of a good root cellar, dug deep into the earth's constant temperature, became common knowledge. They learned to look at the land not just for what was obvious, but for its hidden advantages, the way a ravine could block the wind, the way a stone cliff could hold the sun's warmth. They learned from the girl they had cast out. Ilara's story spread, carried by travelers and trappers to other settlements in the high country. It became a piece of local lore, a tale of resilience and ingenuity. The story of the 17-year-old girl who was kicked out with nothing and built a fortress from a ruin became a lesson in the quiet power of refusing to be broken. Years later, Ilara stood at the entrance to her home. It was larger now, with a small, sturdy barn and terraced gardens climbing the sunny side of the ravine. The girl was gone, replaced by a woman whose strength was etched not in hardness, but in a quiet, deep-seated peace. She watched the creek, her creek, as it flowed tirelessly from the rock, a constant murmur of life. She had been given a pile of rubble, a worthless inheritance, a final, cruel joke. But from it, she had built not just a shelter, but a life. Her legacy was not written in laws or ledgers, but in the stones of her home and in the quiet wisdom she had forced a town to learn. That true worth is never in what you are given, but in the world you have the courage to build for yourself.